They threw a dying Doberman puppy into the blizzard. What happened next changed everything. That night felt as if the whole world wanted to bury me, and a tiny, helpless life beneath the heavy snow swallowing the Teton Range. And for a moment, I truly believed it might succeed because the storm had a way of erasing everything. Footsteps, breath, even sound, until all that remained was cold silence. I don't know why I opened the door right then. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe it was the kind of suffocating quiet that makes you hear the roof collapsing again from fires long past. In Jackson Hole, winter wind slides into the valley like the howl of death itself, cold, sharp, unending. But that night in a blizzard, tearing the sky apart, I heard something else. A sound so small and faint it felt like a final breath caught inside an endless white void. I flipped on the porch light and the yellow glow barely made it a single step before being swallowed whole, and the wind slapped my face with blades of ice, while the snow twisted into frantic spirals that looked like ghostly columns about to collapse. But when I looked down, my heart clenched like a fist around my ribs. A streak of thick, dark red, uneven raw dragged from the bottom step all the way to the edge of the storm's shadow, and it wasn't from a wild animal or some trick of the snow-catching color. It was the trail of something crawling toward my door, as if it knew this was its final chance. "What kind of bastard does this?" I muttered, but the wind ripped the words from my lips. Then I saw it, a tiny, dark shape, curled between ridges of snow so small I almost mistook it for a broken branch, and when I knelt, my hand brushed against something colder than the ground itself, cold like metal, like a body that hadn't finished dying. It was a Doberman puppy, not even 8 weeks old. So small I could lift it with one hand, its black and tan coat plastered to its skin, and tinted blue from the cold, its whole body twitching in violent shivers while its lips had turned a frightening shade of purple. Its belly was so sunken I could count every rib. But what stopped my breath wasn't the cold or the weight of it in my hands. It was the red rope cinched around its neck. The skin was torn, the fur matted with blood, and the rope carried the imprint of someone yanking hard before tossing it aside like trash. It wasn't lost. It wasn't forgotten. It had been tied, dragged, and thrown into the storm to die. I pressed my hand to its chest, no heartbeat. No, not right here. Not in front of me. Not another life slipping away while I watched, and suddenly the screams of my old crew echoed through my skull the night the building burned, the night I dragged a man from the fire only to feel him stop breathing minutes later. I'd carried that memory through every year and every night since. But not tonight. Not this creature. I pulled it onto my lap, my hands shaking but forcing a rhythm as I pressed its tiny chest and counted each compression like a man clinging to the last piece of something he once lost forever. The wind whipped my face, and the storm tore at my breath, but I leaned down and pushed warm air into its mouth. "Don't leave me. You hear me. Don't. Nothing." I felt it getting lighter, like ash slipping through my fingers. I screamed into the storm. "Don't you die. Not tonight." And then a sound as thin as paper, tearing a gasp so fragile it felt like a thread stretching toward the breaking point. A spark of life. I lifted it to my chest, its body stiff as ice against me, and every step I took toward the cabin felt like slicing through the snow with my own bones. But I didn't stop. The door slammed behind us, and I tossed my coat aside, fired up the heater, and wrapped it in my old flannel, one of the last things in my life that still held warmth from a past I'd long buried. It lay there small as a dying ember. I placed my hand on its chest again. One beat, weak, but real. I leaned close and whispered, "If you live, I swear I'll try to keep living too." And in that moment, while the blizzard kept roaring against the door, I knew my life had just changed forever. That morning in Jackson Hole didn't feel like a morning at all. because the storm from the night before still prowled through the valley, roaring down from the Tetons and hurling massive columns of snow straight into the roads, as if the mountains themselves were trying to erase the world. I stood inside my small wooden cabin, with both hands pressed against the stove, trying to force warmth back into fingers that no longer felt like mine, and beneath me, wrapped in that old flannel, the tiny life I'd dragged back from the edge lay motionless with breaths so faint I had to lean close just to see its chest rise. Nothing about it felt safe. Nothing about it felt real. I looked around the room and saw nothing but an old armchair, a few notebooks, a cold cup of coffee, and a burned photograph of my Wyoming fire crew from the year I still believed I was meant to save things, its scorched corner looking uncomfortably like the shape of the life I had now. My name is Ethan Cole, 48 years old. A firefighter for 22 years, a man who once walked into collapsing homes as others fled them, and for a long time I thought I was built for pulling people out of hell and delivering them back to the living. Then came the day I couldn't save the person who mattered most. Chris, my closest brother in the field. The flash, the blast, the black smoke swallowing him right in front of me, left a wound deeper than any flame. And even though I dragged him out 3 hours later, he died in the ER, while the heart monitor flattened into a sound that slammed through my skull like a steel door. I didn't walk out of that hospital as the same man. I don't think I ever will. The nightmares, the phantom explosions, the smell of smoke threading itself into my hair and skin, those things pushed me out of the job, out of my life, out of myself. And though the doctors called it PTSD, I called it a shadow that refused to let me go. So I moved to the mountains of Jackson Hole, far from town, and farther from people hoping isolation might quiet the ghosts, because this cabin sits deep in the pines about 2 miles from Moose Creek with no neighbors nearby and no traffic, just the breath of wind dragging across the ridge and the steady hush of falling snow. Solitude was my choice, until last night when it became a punishment. I bent down to check the pup's warmth again and found it still alive, but so weak I had to swallow hard just to steady myself, and each tiny breath it took tugged loose memories I'd buried so deep I hoped never to feel them again. A helpless life thrown into a storm like trash. A red rope still marked by the force of whoever yanked it. A heart that had stopped and then started again beneath my hands. All of it felt like fragments of my own smoke-stained past, scarred, frozen, full of things that had no place in anyone's life. I sat beside the little thing with my back against the stove and pulled the flannel closer, placing my hand gently over its head, and its thin fur was cold but catching just enough heat from the fire to remind me warmth still existed somewhere. I let out a breath. I hadn't realized I'd forgotten how to breathe. It felt like letting go of a weight I'd been carrying for years. A new kind of fear crept into me, not the fear that it might die, but the fear that it might live, and I would have to learn how to keep something close again. I looked out the window where wind slammed against the glass hard enough to make the cabin tremble, while the Tetons disappeared behind a white blur, a reminder that nature can be cruel but fair, unlike what people had done to this pup, something for which there was no excuse. Without thinking, my voice came out rough from cold and sleeplessness. I don't know why they did that, but I'm not letting it end here. When I turned back, I saw its chest rising a little stronger, and the tiny tail twitching as if it could hear me, as if it was answering. In that moment, something had shifted inside this cabin, and it wasn't the heat or the light. It was the simple truth that I was no longer alone. And for the first time in years I felt something unfamiliar tapping gently in my chest. Not the old shadows, not the fear. Something that looked a lot like hope. The next morning in Jackson Hole looked nothing like morning, because the sky was still a muted gray curtain, and the snow had piled so thick against the cabin windows that it swallowed even the weak winter sunlight struggling to break through, leaving the room dim and cold, in a way that made every shadow feel heavier. Ember lay beside the stove, small as a dying ember, true to her name, her breathing steadier now, yet still so faint. I had to study her chest to be certain she was still here. I knew I couldn't just sit there and hope time would be kind to her. She needed more than a man haunted by his own ghosts could give alone. I wrapped Ember in the thickest towel I owned, placed her gently in a small wooden box, and ran to the truck while frost coated the windshield so stubbornly I had to scrape it away with my bare hands. And when I opened the door, the wind hit me hard enough to knock the breath backward in my throat, as if trying to shove doubt into my chest. The 191 down from the cabin into Teton Valley usually took 25 minutes, but that morning the road was a sheet of slick mud and frozen slush that turned the drive into nearly an hour of wrestling the wheel, while crosswinds shoved the truck sideways with every turn, forcing my knuckles white around the steering column. Every time the tires slipped, Ember let out the faintest whimper. Each one stabbed straight into my ribs. "Hold on, kid," I said, unsure whether my voice shook from fear or cold. "I'm right here. Don't give up on me." When the old wooden sign reading Teton Valley Animal Clinic finally appeared through the storm haze, my whole body loosened so suddenly it hurt, and my arms ached from gripping the wheel as if I'd been trying to hold the world together by force. I carried Ember inside with urgency, the metal wind chime above the door ringing sharply as I opened it, its bright tone cutting through the morning's eerie silence like a signal flare. A woman with streaked silver hair and a pale blue blouse stepped from the back room, and her eyes were sharp but not unkind, the kind of eyes that had seen too much suffering and still managed to hold on to a measure of gentleness. "I'm Maggie Rowe," she said softly. "Let me see this little one." I placed Ember on the steel exam table, and she bent over with movements so precise and delicate I found myself holding my breath, because everything she did looked like someone handling a piece of old, fragile glass that could shatter at the slightest wrong touch. She listened to Ember's heart, checked her reflexes, pressed gently along her abdomen, and after several long, aching moments, she finally spoke. About 8 weeks old. Severe hypothermia. Malnutrition. Deep rope burns. Then she looked up at me. Someone tied her. Pulled hard. Then threw her out into the snow. My jaw clenched so fiercely that a bolt of pain shot down my neck. I found her right at my doorstep. Dr. Rowe nodded as if she had already expected that answer. The good news is, she's still swallowing on her own. That means she hasn't given up yet. For the first time in hours, I exhaled without feeling like something inside me might crack. She opened a drawer, pulled out a small vial, a warm bottle of milk, and several sheets of instructions, then placed them carefully in front of me. "You'll need to feed her warm milk every 3 hours. Keep her near a heat source but not too close. And most important," she met my eyes, "don't leave her alone." I frowned. Why not? Her smile was faint but steady. Dobermans bond deeply. They need to know someone is staying with them. If they don't, they let go fast. She brushed a gentle hand over Ember's head. "She chose you the moment you breathed life into her last night. This breed, once they choose, they don't leave." I touched Ember lightly, and though she was too weak to open her eyes, her tiny eyelids fluttered and she leaned the faintest bit toward my hand, a fragile instinct of survival reaching for something warm. I swallowed hard. It wasn't just her who needed someone. Maybe I needed her too. Something inside me, silent since the day Chris died, shifted like a coal stirring under ash and ember, with nothing but her small trembling body had somehow breathed a hint of warmth into it. When I left the clinic with Ember cradled to my chest, the cold wind struck my face again, but this time it didn't feel like loneliness biting into me. This time it felt like purpose. In that moment, I understood something simple and terrifying and true. I wasn't just saving a dog. I was saving the part of myself I thought had died long ago. Snow was still falling when I drove away from Dr. Maggie Rowe's clinic, because the road back to the cabin cut through a forest of dark pines, buried beneath ankle-deep drifts, and everything looked washed in a pale winter haze that made the world feel fragile in a way I hadn't felt in years. I glanced at the passenger seat where Ember lay, curled in her wool blanket, her tiny head leaning toward me as if she were fighting to keep her eyes open just long enough to make sure I hadn't disappeared. She was weak, but she wasn't quitting, and neither was I. Back at the cabin, I set Ember in the wooden box near the stove, adding a layer of soft towels the same way Dr. Rowe had shown me, and though the schedule she gave me, warm milk every 3 hours, didn't fit the life of a man battling PTSD sleeplessness and the way every slam of wind against the door made me flinch. I looked at Ember and realized I would relearn everything if that's what it took. Step by step. Beat by beat. Breath by breath. I warmed the milk and tested the temperature against my wrist warm. Not hot before filling a tiny syringe and cradling her head in my palm, and every drop I pressed gently toward her mouth felt like I was holding a thread that might stitch her life back together. The first drop slid down. She didn't swallow. The second drop followed. No reaction. I forced myself to stay calm even as my pulse thudded in my throat, hearing Dr. Rowe's voice echo, "She hasn't given up. And you can't either." The third drop touched her lips and her head jerked faintly. Her tongue twitched and a tiny clicking sound escaped her mouth, soft, fragile. But to me it was the sound of a locked room in my chest, cracking open after being sealed for years. She swallowed. I laughed, a cracked, exhausted laugh that startled me enough to place a hand on my chest, just to confirm it was real. By afternoon, Ember woke for the second time since I found her, her pale brown eyes opening like a thin veil lifting off Jackson Lake in early winter. And when those eyes searched for me, something inside me shifted in a way I hadn't believed my heart was still capable of. She recognized me, not as a shadow near the stove, but as a place to hold on to. A small creature pulled back from death was looking at me without doubt, without fear, without hesitation. Only a silent question, I felt rather than heard. "Are you staying?" I pulled the armchair closer to the wooden box, and Ember pushed herself up on shaky legs, her front paws trembling as though they couldn't quite hold her own tiny weight yet. She stepped anyway. One step, then another. And then, driven by some instinct older than reason, she stumbled straight into my leg and rested her head against my ankle with a relieved sigh. I froze, not out of fear of hurting her, but because I understood something in that moment with a clarity that nearly unmade me. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. This was a connection, a kind of bond I thought had been ripped from me the night Chris died. I bent down and brushed my hand over Ember's head. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." She answered by placing her tiny paw on my boot, an ordinary gesture so small it should have meant nothing, yet it sent a shiver up my spine because no one had held on to me like that in years. Not with trust so complete, not with dependence that pure. When night settled over the mountains, I pulled the armchair close to the stove and Ember slept against my foot, her head resting on the old work boot I'd kept since my firefighting days, and the crack of the fire mixed with the wind outside, but for the first time in years those sounds didn't tighten my chest. Instead, I heard Ember's breathing, soft, steady, peaceful, like waves reaching some distant shore. I realized I was no longer perched on the edge with those old memories clawing at me. I was right here in this cabin with a life that had crawled back from death simply because I refused to let go. And softly, more to myself than to her, I whispered, "Ember, if you keep fighting, then so will I." Outside, the storm kept roaring, but inside the cabin, a small flame had finally come back to life. 3 weeks had passed since the night Ember fully opened her eyes, and Jackson Hole was already bracing for another snowstorm as the people in Moose Creek murmured that winter had come faster, heavier, and colder than anyone predicted, the sky lowering over the Tetons like a funeral shroud being slowly drawn across a still body. I stood on the cabin porch watching that gray sheet descend, feeling the familiar tension in the air, an omen of something brewing both outside and inside me. Meanwhile, Ember ran across the yard with steadier legs than ever, her black and tan coat gleaming in the dim afternoon light as her small ears flicked each time the wind shifted. Every time I called her name, she bolted toward me like an arrow and sat right in front of me waiting for praise. She was recovering faster than I expected, and because of that, I forgot something important. Trauma never leaves quietly. Not hers, not mine. The storm hit at 5 p.m. Wind slammed against the windows hard enough to rattle the glass, and that pounding, steady, rhythmic, relentless sounded too much like metal warping during the fires I once walked through, making my breath tighten and sweat soak through my shirt as my heart hammered violently against my ribs. I heard Chris calling my name, the ceiling crashing down, the oxygen tank exploding. PTSD doesn't need a reason. It only needs a spark. And that night, the Wyoming wind was the match. I staggered back, gripping the armchair so tightly my knuckles burned, and a broken gasp tore from my throat before I could stop it. Then I heard something else, softer than the storm, but clearer than any memory. The sound of Ember's tiny paws tapping on the wooden floor. She walked toward me, slow, steady, unafraid, and when she reached me, she placed her head on my knee and breathed out a long, quiet exhale as if saying, "Look at me, not the past." I collapsed into the chair, panting like a man who had sprinted up the stairs of a burning building, and Ember climbed onto me, placing her front paws on my chest as she pressed her forehead against my chin. A small warmth spread across my skin, breaking through the spiral of panic like the first crack of light under a closed door. I laid a hand on her back. I'm okay. Just need a minute. But I wasn't okay. Not even close. And Ember knew. She didn't leave me. Not for a second. As the panic loosened its grip and the storm roared on, Ember curled beside my feet, her ears twitching every time my breathing changed, and I realized she was watching over me the same way I had watched over her during those first fragile nights. But the night wasn't done with us. Around 10 p.m., the power went out. The lights vanished, the heater died, and the cabin fell into a darkness so heavy it felt like a tangible thing, the storm scraping across the walls as though trying to rip the roof free. In that suffocating dark, Ember suddenly stood up. She let out a soft growl, not fear, but alertness. I moved to the window and through the moonlit haze of the storm saw something shifting in the yard, a figure, an animal, a shadow. I couldn't tell, but Ember stepped in front of me, back, arched slightly, ears up, eyes sharp like glowing embers in the night. "Hey, easy," I whispered. She didn't budge. Only after the shadow slid past the tree line and disappeared did Ember finally turn back toward me. And in that moment I understood something strange. She had shifted from surviving to protecting, from fear to strength, from needing a place to lean to becoming a place I could lean. And I, a man who had spent half his life buried under ashes, was learning to trust a creature who had once hovered between life and death. When the power returned and the cabin lit up again, Ember walked slowly toward me and placed her paw on my thigh, as if confirming I was still all right. I turned my chair and pulled her into my arms, and I couldn't remember the last time I held anyone like that. But that night in the heaviest snowstorm of the Wyoming winter, I allowed myself to do the one thing I had feared for years, trust. I whispered into her ear, "You came back from death. I'll learn how to do that too." Ember lifted her head and licked my hand once. Just once. But to me it wasn't the gesture of a dog. It was the first ritual of healing between two broken beings trying to piece themselves back together. Outside, the storm howled through the night, but inside that small cabin, I realized something undeniable. I wasn't saving Ember. Ember was pulling me out of the storm inside my own chest. The storm passed that night, leaving Jackson Hole quiet as a long exhale, and the next morning when I opened the cabin door, sunlight glinted across the fresh snow so sharply it forced me to squint as Ember bounded after me with her tiny paws, stamping clear trails across the white surface, her thin black tail swaying like a small thread of hope stitched into the cold air. I watched her stand at the edge of the porch and stare up at the Tetons as the wind puffed her short coat, and for the first time she looked as if she truly belonged here, solid, steady, unbroken. No more trembling, no more curling into herself. Gone was the lost look of an abandoned creature. What remained was the gaze of a survivor, a small warrior in every sense. I sat on the porch with my hand extended, and Ember ran to me and rested her muzzle on my knee, the way she always did, a silent ritual that had become the language between us. I stroked her head, my fingers brushing across the faint scar on her neck, the ghost of someone's cruelty pressed into her skin. But she was alive, and something inside me was too. In the days after the storm, Ember grew as quickly as spring grass in Wyoming, racing around the cabin each morning with my old glove in her mouth, like it was her life's treasure, barking every time she saw me step onto the porch, and lying against my leg each night when the wind battered the roof as if to say, "Tonight we get through this together." At some point, quietly, without ceremony, the cabin that once felt cold and hollow had become a home again, and I realized I no longer woke gasping in the dark, or felt my chest tighten at the sound of wind, or carried the certainty that I would always fail to hold on to someone. Ember had changed that, not with words or miracles, but with presence, pure, steady, honest presence that kept me from hiding in the shadows of myself. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the Tetons, Ember lay in the yard watching the final streaks of light fade from the sky, and I sat beside her in the snow with no need for conversation, because silence had become its own kind of truth. I touched her head. "You know, Ember, I thought I pulled you out of the storm. Turns out you're the one pulling me out of mine." She lifted her head and looked at me with those deep brown eyes as if she understood every word. And maybe in the way dogs do, she really did. When the snow began to melt and the road to Moose Creek showed through the thinning ice, I decided to bring Ember back to Dr. Rowe for a checkup, and when I carried Ember inside, Dr. Rowe let out a soft, delighted laugh. "Well, look at you, a true survivor." Ember stepped toward her and gently rested her head in the doctor's hand. "She looks healthier than I do," I joked. Dr. Rowe laughed, but her eyes lingered on me longer than I expected. "Not just her, Ethan. You're different too." I didn't respond. She didn't need me to, because she was right, I was different. I wasn't just a man running from the past anymore. I was a man learning to live again, one small moment at a time because of a pup thrown into a snowstorm. That evening, when we returned to the cabin, I stood in the doorway watching Ember run across the soft snow, and her life no longer felt fragile. It felt loud and certain. The stomp of paws, the ring of a bark, the rush of movement that rewrote the truth that she had survived and won. I knelt down with my arms open. Ember leapt into me, pressing her small body against my chest, as her warm breath curled against my neck, and once again she chose me not because I saved her, but because I stayed. "Thank you for not leaving me in the storm," I whispered. She answered by licking my hand, once simple, quiet enough to say she understood. And that is why I tell this story. Not to claim I did something remarkable, not to say I saved a life, but to remind anyone who hears it that sometimes the smallest, most broken creatures help us rediscover the best parts of ourselves. If one day you find a pair of frightened eyes, lonely shaking but still holding a flicker of hope, don't turn away. Because one moment of reaching out, it might change someone's entire world. And maybe just like me, you'll be saved in ways you never expected.